What happens when America's most dangerous gangsters all gather in one room, on foreign soil, with Frank Sinatra as the cover act? In 1946, the Mafia held a secret meeting in Havana, Cuba, a meeting so important it shaped organized crime for the next 50 years. Lucky Luciano was there, even after being deported. Meyer Lansky was there, laying plans for a Caribbean gambling empire, and Vito Genovese was plotting against them all. This wasn't just a party. It was a power struggle, a drug debate, and a global business plan disguised as a vacation. By the end of this story, you'll know why the Havana Conference was the single most pivotal gathering in Mafia history, and how it changed the underworld forever. In December of 1946, under the warm lights of the Hotel Nacional in Havana, the most powerful mobsters in America quietly gathered for what would become one of the most important meetings in organized crime history. To the outside world, it looked like a glamorous weekend in the tropics. Inside, it was the future of the Mafia being decided. The world had changed since Prohibition and the bloody Castellamarese War. Lucky Luciano, the architect of the American Mafia's National Syndicate, had been convicted and deported to Italy after World War II. But Luciano wasn't ready to fade into the background. From exile, he sought a way to remind the American bosses that he was still their leader. The venue was no coincidence. Cuba was perfect, close enough to the US to gather everyone. Yet beyond the reach of federal law, Meyer Lansky, the Mafia's financial genius, already had deep connections with Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista. Lansky saw Havana as an untapped goldmine, casinos, hotels, and nightclubs waiting to become the Syndicate's playground. The official cover for the gathering was a lavish party. Frank Sinatra flew in, the finest liquor flowed, and the Hotel Nacional was filled with laughter and music. But beneath the spectacle, serious business was underway. Luciano wanted to reassert himself as boss of bosses, even from thousands of miles away. Around the table sat names that would echo through the history of organized crime: Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner; Santo Trafficante, who would one day dominate Cuba; representatives of the Chicago outfit; and Vito Genovese, Luciano's greatest rival. The agenda was heavy. First, narcotics. Post-war Europe and Asia had created new heroin pipelines, and Luciano pushed hard for the Syndicate to embrace the drug trade. Some feared it would bring too much heat from law enforcement, but Luciano argued the profits were irresistible. Second, Havana itself. Lansky pitched his vision of casinos lining the Malecon, with Batista's government handsomely bribed to look the other way. The Mafia's money could flow through Cuba like water, laundered through dice, cards, and slot machines. But not everything was celebration. Behind the smiles, Vito Genovese was circling. He believed Luciano's deportation had left a vacuum, and he intended to fill it. For Genovese, this conference wasn't about reinforcing Luciano's leadership, it was about undermining it. The first nights of the Havana Conference were dazzling. Expensive suits, fine cigars, and women in glittering dresses filled the halls of the Hotel Nacional. But behind closed doors, the tone was deadly serious. The Mafia bosses weren't there for pleasure. They were there to shape the future. Lucky Luciano, fresh from exile, wasted no time asserting himself. He presented himself as the Syndicate statesman, the man who had brought order to chaos during the bloody days of the 1930s. Even from Italy, Luciano argued he could still serve as the ultimate arbitrator of disputes and the visionary guiding their expansion. But not everyone agreed. Vito Genovese, Luciano's former lieutenant, had his own ambitions. Genovese saw Luciano's deportation as weakness. In private, he whispered to allies that the era of Luciano was over and that new leadership was needed. Genovese didn't just want a seat at the table, he wanted the table itself. The key flashpoint of the conference came when the conversation turned back to narcotics. Luciano pressed hard, insisting that heroin distribution should be systematized under the Mafia's control. He envisioned a network stretching from European suppliers, through Cuban ports, into American cities. Genovese, seizing the moment, openly challenged him. He claimed Luciano was out of touch, that a man exiled in Italy couldn't possibly control operations in America. The room grew tense. To criticize Luciano so directly was dangerous, but Genovese believed his time had come. It might have worked, except for the silent respect Luciano still commanded. Meyer Lansky, ever the diplomat, quickly backed Luciano's proposal, framing it not just as drugs but as a business decision. The profits, Lansky explained, could dwarf anything the Mafia had made during Prohibition. Even the skeptical bosses found themselves nodding. Meanwhile, Luciano had his own countermove prepared. Before the conference, he had spread word through intermediaries that Genovese had ambitions far beyond respect, that he was disloyal, even treacherous. These whispers weren't unfounded. Years earlier, while Luciano was in prison, Genovese had maneuvered ruthlessly for control, and everyone in the room knew it. As the debate raged, the tide turned. One by one, the bosses sided with Luciano. The narcotics trade would be formalized, Havana would become a mafia stronghold, and Luciano would remain the symbolic head of the syndicate, even from afar. Genovese left Havana frustrated, his challenge diffused but not forgotten. The other mobsters had seen his ambition laid bare, and though Luciano had won the conference, the seeds of future betrayal were planted. Outside, the celebrations continued. Guests at the Hotel Nacional thought they were witnessing the mafia on vacation, Sinatra singing, mobsters laughing, and cash pouring across the casino tables. In reality, they were watching history unfold, the mafia transforming from a national crime syndicate into an international empire. By the time the Havana Conference ended, two things were clear. First, the mafia was entering the narcotics trade on a scale never before attempted. And second, Havana was about to become the beating heart of organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. But the shadow of betrayal lingered, and the uneasy peace forged in Cuba wouldn't last forever. In the months that followed, Havana became the mafia's glittering jewel. Meyer Lansky transformed Cuba into the playground he had always envisioned. Luxury casinos, nightclubs buzzing until dawn, and rivers of cash flowing through the island. Batista's government, bribed at every level, ensured the mafia operated with impunity. Lucky Luciano had accomplished his goal. Though he lived in exile, the Havana Conference proved he was still the name that commanded respect. Through Lansky and his allies, he kept a hand in the game, directing international narcotics routes and collecting tribute from America's most powerful crime families. But the victory was fragile. Luciano's presence in Havana drew too much attention. Word reached the US government, and officials were furious that a man they had deported was suddenly hosting mob summits just 90 miles from American shores. Pressure was placed on Cuba, and in 1947, Luciano was forced to leave Havana and return to Italy for good. Vito Genovese, patient and ruthless, waited for his moment. He would eventually seize control of the Luciano family back in New York, rebranding it under his own name. The seeds of betrayal planted in Havana sprouted years later, leading to bloody conflicts and power shifts that shook the mafia's foundations. Yet the decisions made at the Havana Conference carried forward. The mafia's formal entry into narcotics turned heroin into one of the syndicate's most profitable and destructive ventures. The drug pipelines established in those years fueled addiction across America and brought the underworld unprecedented wealth. Cuba, too, would play a central role. Throughout the 1950s, Havana rivaled Las Vegas as the mafia's cash cow, with Lansky orchestrating its casinos into a billion-dollar empire. For a time, it looked as though Cuba would remain the mafia's offshore paradise forever. But history had other plans. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution toppled Batista, and within months the mob's casinos were seized, their investments gone overnight. Still, the Havana Conference left an undeniable legacy. It symbolized the mafia at its most ambitious, no longer just neighborhood gangs, but an international syndicate capable of shaping politics, moving narcotics, and building empires far beyond America's borders. For Lucky Luciano, it was a final demonstration of power. Though his years on American soil were over, Havana proved that even in exile, he could bend the mafia to his will. For the world, it was a glimpse behind the curtain, a criminal organization capable of global coordination, operating in the shadows while presenting a face of glamour, celebrity, and sophistication. And for organized crime itself, it was a turning point, the moment the American Mafia stopped being just an American problem and became a global one. The Havana Conference was more than a meeting, it was the mafia's coming of age, a moment when Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and their allies set the underworld on a path that would change history. If you want to explore more hidden stories like this, the secrets, the betrayals, the moments history forgot, subscribe to the channel and watch the next video in our Mafia History series.